Welcome to the Myth and Magic Authors Podcast, folklore and fantasy topics aimed at creative storytellers. To write stories and challenge your brain with exciting ideas, delve into these presentations and reflections. See how fantasy realms are based on actual world history, legend, and lore. Study fairy tales, nature fables, and supernaturalism to engage in a jumble of concepts that will trigger your fancy and get you writing imaginatively. Now, here's your host, Neil Mack.
So because it's dark and it's getting towards halfway through March, and it's still quite cold and miserable here in England, I suppose my mind has been turning to the darker side. And I'm going to talk today about the dark triad and how you can use that to create really potent antagonists. But first, I want to discuss something which I think is going to help invigorate your writing. It's called the fluxus, and it's spelled F-L-U-X-U-S. What is the fluxus and how can it be used to invigorate your writing? So let's go. The fluxus was an important international and interdisciplinary community of artists and composers and designers and even poets who engaged in experimental art performances during the 1960s and the 1970s. And the key to fluxus is to emphasise the artistic process over any finished product. Fluxus artists tended to perform interdisciplinary art activities, and they used the term intermedia, I-N-T-E-R-M-E-D-I-A. And this is when you would pair two genres. So you pair drawing and poetry, or you pair painting and theatre together and then perform it. A great example of this kind of activity, of intermedia activity, is the Japanese poems known as Heiga. I hope that's how you pronounce it, H-A-I-G-A. And these are typical lines of poetry that are painted with a paintbrush alongside images. And normally the same brush and the same ink is used for the poem and the image. And of course, for us, simple comic book tales, comic books that combine artwork with lines of dialogue, work in exactly the same way. And if you were you are still a fan of the Illumini files, which is spelled I-L-L-U-M-I-N-A-E, which were written by J. Christoph and Amy Kaufman, and it was a 2015 space opera, you'll know that the Illumini files utilised photocopied documents, emails and transcripts of interviews, as well as diagrams and other non-textual matter to tell an otherwise fairly straightforward retro space adventure, but in a bold and a graphic way, even though it's contained within a book, a novel-like book. And it was not a comic book. It was an example of this intermedia, the idea of interdisciplinary art activities joined together to create fiction. And if you like the Illumini files, then you'll understand the remarkable oomph that taking an interdisciplinary approach can bring to your fiction. Now, I don't expect you to be able to produce a graphic novel, unless you're a great artist, or even illustrate your next book, but you might like to add a piece of artwork to your next poem or your next short story. And if you can't do art at all, what about adding a photograph to it or just a little pen sketch? So fluxus art is all about interpretation and explication and visualization. So if you can render your thoughts using some other artistic language, what I mean by that is other than words, that help make sense of your ideas or help clarify your ideas to your audience, then it's fluxus art. And if you can elaborate your thoughts by making them plain and comprehensible to an audience, perhaps with diagrams or maps or spoken word or song or handcrafts or some other non-text based art, then it will be fluxus art. And if you can outline your thoughts in an interpretive way that provides a mental picture to your audience of something that is otherwise invisible or abstract to them, then it's fluxus art. And that's what I mean about fluxus art being interpretation, explication, and visualization. There are some loose rules. They obviously didn't like rules, the artists who went into infert fluxus, but there are some loose rules that they wrote up. Fluxus is an attitude, not a style. Fluxus is about intermedia, seeing how common or everyday objects intersect with each other in a way that might illustrate your work. Fluxus is simple. In other words, the work should be short, it should be brief, it should be just a small digression from your main activity. And fluxus is fun. It's meant to get your imagination bubbling. So it ought to be a gladsome task, and it can be as silly as you like, because fluxus is fun. And finally, fluxus works best when it's childlike. So you need to be guileless and unself-conscious and playful when you experiment this way. But how inventive can you be? Well, you don't have to be totally bonkers, and you don't have to be full-on avant-garde, countercultural transgressive to take on the fluxus. Neither do you have to be pretentious or uppity to be in this group, because it isn't about making arty-farty creations that nobody wants to see or hear. It's instead about blurring boundaries. I like that way of thinking about it. It's about blurring boundaries between art forms. And let's be clear, we do it every day, so it shouldn't come as any surprise to most of us. So what I mean about blurring boundaries between art forms is that you've probably used an emoji at an end of a sentence, haven't you? And of course that is blurring a boundary. You've scribbled a note on a napkin, and then you've probably done a little doodle to go with it, and you've pinned that to a corkboard. That's blurring the boundaries. You've probably chosen a postcard for your mood board that kind of sums up everything you wanted to say about your protagonist. Well, that's blurring the boundaries. You've probably chosen a pop song that motivates you, or certainly motivates the character's progress through your novel. Well, that's blurring the boundaries. You've probably admired a funny meme, and you've chosen it and either shared it on social medias or even pinned it on your board. That's all blurring the boundaries between art forms. All those things that you've been doing are actually using the fluxus. But there are some ways you can use the fluxus in even more creative ways, and I'm going to go through those now. These are my tips for using the fluxus to get your imagination bubbling. Tip number 1, try creating some concrete poetry. For instance, if you're writing a poem about an egg, the words that you use would form an oval shape on the page. Do you get me? That's why it's called concrete poetry. If we were writing a poem about a heroine, and she was an angelic heroine, then the words might form a set of angel wings on the page. And of course, if your poem was about a villainess, devilish villainess, then the words might form a set of scary bat wings. So write a little poem about your protagonist or your antagonist or one of your major characters, and try to do it as a concrete poem. In other words, try to create the shape of the image on the paper. My next tip is to try creating a calligram, which is spelled C-A-L-L-I-G-R-A-M. Use a phrase that you've written before and you're quite proud of, or a portion of text. For example, one of the greatest paragraphs you've just recently written, and then present these words in a thematically related image. So for example, what I mean by this is if your demon is described as a horned and hoofed wolf being, try presenting those words in the image of a fanged werewolf. You can either make the image yourself using words like in the concrete poem, but be strict with yourself. You may only use the words in your extract. Don't try to find new ones. This isn't about writing, it's about blurring the boundaries, don't forget. Or you can find an image, an outline of an image that you might want to use on social media or online, and you can fill in the image with your carefully chosen words. And that's what a calligram is. A calligram is an image which is filled with the words that you've already written. So this isn't about writing new words, this is about using words you've already written and blurring the boundaries. My next tip is try some freeform sound art. Grab your smartphone, or a gadget for this one, and recall a moment, a scene perhaps from the fiction you're currently writing, and press record. Say out loud a batch of single words, not sentences, because it's important that these words don't join up to form sentences, because this is blurring boundaries again, and you'll not get the free flow if you try to do that. The idea of this is not to be cohesive. It's not about cohesiveness, it's not about grammar or punctuation. If your words have a connectedness and an interdependence, that's fine, but they don't have to, so that's fine too. This is about free thought. What you're aiming to do here is to try to be vital, try to be alive, and try to think of richness of sounds. So don't record more than 20 seconds. In fact, try to keep it even shorter. Have a few goes and allow your subconscious, the subconscious part of your creativity, to do all the work for you. Grab your smartphone, recall a moment, and then say out loud a batch of single words that somehow have something to do with that moment. So you don't read out the page, you just recall in your imagination the scene, and then shout out a bunch of words which have something to do, some kind of connectedness or dependence to that scene. Just shout them out. You'll find that it kind of will be a poem out of the air, out of your subconscious. And if you want, and if you like the sound of it, and you might need to have a few goes, but if you like the sound of it, you could share the sound art on your socials, and you could explain that you'd be doing a bit of fluxus, and I think your audience, your readers, will be quite impressed. The next thing, and it's my final tip for using fluxus to help you write, is try to find some publication poetry. Now, I've been doing this every week since Christmas. I've been doing it once a week. And I like to use glossy magazines for this fluxus. The glossier, the better, by the way. And I especially like the food and cooking pages. So how it works is this. First, I find a word or sometimes a phrase that says something. Doesn't have to be direct, but it could be indirect, but says something about the work that I'm currently doing. Now, you'd think, wouldn't you, that it would be impossible to find a fantasy fiction related word or fantasy fiction related phrase in a magazine article about cooking. But you'd be wrong. It's actually quite surprisingly easy. Once I found what I call the hook word, so maybe I'd accidentally found a recipe for angel cakes, and obviously the hook word is the angel, I pick up a pen. It's a thick pen that I use, a Sharpie, but you could use a highlighter, and there are two approaches to this. But the general idea is to then find the rest of the words that have been hidden within that text, and don't forget the text was written by somebody else. So within the text written by the original author, and of course unknown to him or her, you find those hidden words and you mark them. You mark them as found. Now, there are two ways, like I say, of doing this. You either highlight the correct words, which is one way of doing it, so just circle the correct words, the ones which mean something to you, or you disguise the incorrect words. So every single thing that which has nothing to do with you, you put your black mark across. Or you do a bit of both, that's fine as well. And what you'll do as you do this is you'll retrieve a lost poem that's been hidden on the page. It's a bit like word archaeology. And when you do this, I'm sure you'll discover something rewarding and something quite extraordinary, because you'll find that the passage will magically develop in front of your very eyes. And it will give you new thoughts, and it will help fine-tune and even facilitate meanings that you hadn't even had in your head before. So I've put it on the show notes. I've done a little bit on a blog, and I've got some examples on my blog. So I would like you to give this a go, to find some publication and then uncover the hidden poem. But that's how to use the fluxus to invigorate your writing. If you're using any other types of art where it blurs the boundaries between two, let me know, and I'll be interested to read about them, and I'd like to share them if I could. So let me know on Twitter at Neilmach, Neilmach, all one word, using the fluxus. What is the dark triad? And how can you use the dark triad to pen truly wicked evildoers? When you're writing a hero's nemesis, You'll want him or her or it or they to be truly reprehensible. But how do you portray a foe that's totally abhorrent without resorting to caricature or cartoon-like imagery? Well, you'll need to use the dark triad. If you want to imbue your baddie with properly malevolent qualities, I highly recommend that you describe and detail the personality traits known as the dark triad, and they're known as dark, by the way, because of their malevolency and not anything to do with their shade. All three dark triad traits are distinct, but these traits overlap. And these overlapping traits are almost always present in criminal minds. If you're a fan of murder mystery suspense thrillers, then you'll probably already have encountered these, even if you didn't know what they were called. All three traits must be present in a person before their deviant behaviour leads to serious criminality. So if you are looking at a serial killer, if you're looking at a person who is consistently bad, it's almost certain that they will have the dark triad traits. So the three dark triad traits are these. Are you ready? Number 1, narcissism. This is a lack of empathy towards others, together with an overbearing sense of pride and presumption. Number 2 is Machiavellianism. This is egocentricity that's characterised by the manipulation and the exploitation of others. And number 3 is psychopathy or psychopathy. This is antisocial behaviour, impulsivity and remorselessness. So a little bit more about those. Narcissistic types tend to have a lopsided sense of entitlement and a sense of dominance and a sense of superiority. Machiavellian types are sly and deceitful and amoral, unprincipled and cold. And psychopathic types are the kind of person who demonstrates low levels of empathy combined with high levels of impulsivity and thrill-seeking. When you're endowing your baddie with characteristics from the dark triad, try to reason out the factors behind that character's maladjustments. If you do that, then you will create a truly believable baddie. So, for example, environmental reasons. How was your antagonist raised? Was the baddie raised in wartime, or in a broken family, or in a prison environment, or in some other harsh and unforgiving upbringing? And next, were these persons' traits assimilated through nurture or lack of nurture? So, for example, was the antagonist's parents unloving? Were they unkind? Was it an abusive relationship? Was it a brutalising relationship? Were there any other factors? Were the parents unavailable? The next are the hereditary reasons. Is there any history of inherited or intergenerational mental disorder in the family? And the next is clinical reasons. Has any sickness or infection or poisoning or addiction caused this mental state? If you take a typical baddie, like a cartoon baddie, for example, the Joker, and then test them against, first of all, the dark triad. So, for example, are they narcissistic? Have they got a sense of entitlement? Are they Machiavellian? In other words, are they unprincipled and cold? Are they psychopathic? In other words, do they enjoy high levels of thrill-seeking and impulsivity? And then think about the reasons for those maladjustments. How was the baddie raised? Was the person brutalised, or was the person unloved as they were brought up? Are there hereditary reasons, or are there any sickness or clinical reasons, for example, an addiction? And there's another trait, and it's called the fourth dark trait, and this is actually what makes what we call the tetrad, T-E-T-R-A-D, the tetrad. And the fourth dark trait, which is probably present in cartoon characters like the Joker, is everyday sadism. Everyday sadism is the enjoyment of cruelty for cruelty's sake. So the kind of boy who pulls the wings off of insects is an everyday sadist. It's the revelling in another person's unfortunate tumble. It's the bringing down of a hero. This behaviour explains a lot about internet trolling, by the way, because tetrad types, the people who are all four of the dark traits, they luxuriate in the maltreatment that they inflict or they enjoy witnessing. So what they like to do is they like to see somebody else being maltreated, and they prefer it if the cruelty is perpetrated on a complete innocent. So for this group, the ill treatment is even more thrilling when the victim is totally helpless or innocuous or gullible. This is called the lamb to the slaughter effect. If the victim is completely innocent and almost unknowing and gullible, it's even more exciting if you're sadistic to that person. If your antagonist has all three dark triad traits, does he or she or it or they also exhibit everyday sadism? In other words, do they actually exhibit the fourth dark trait, the tetrad? Let me know how you get on with this and see if you can use the dark triad to create a truly wicked but also believable baddie. And listen to my Myth and Magic episode 54, which was broadcast on 7th of October 2020, and it's how to use the banality of evil theory to create a truly realistic antagonist. Also in that same show, by the way, I also listed a handy list of Dark Lord flaws and a list of traits that are associated with psychopaths. So I think you need to give that a listen as well. That's episode 54 that was broadcast on October the 7th, 2020. But let me know how you're getting on with creating your evildoer. If you have any other tips or advice or just want to have your book mentioned, please tweet me at Neil Mac, Neilmach, all one word. Otherwise, I'll see you next week for more Myth and Magic.